Hi everybody, today we're going to be talking about program grant ADA compliance. My name is Christina Gunther and I'm the founder and co-chair of Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium, or CCAC. This PowerPoint is meant to assist you in understanding the new IACA grantee requirements, which include appointing an accessibility coordinator, completing the Section 504 workbook, and if you have other questions or for more general information about the program grant, you can visit arts.illinois.gov. What is the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act? Let's dive right in. The ADA is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life. It was passed pretty recently. It was passed in 1990 and was updated in 2010. It was really inspired by Section 504, which we're going to talk about in a little while. The ADA applies to covered entities regardless of funding sources. It's really about providing accommodations and modifying policies and procedures to ensure equal access for people with disabilities. Some examples of an accommodation might be a request for American Sign Language interpretation by a visitor who's deaf. And an example of modifying policies and procedures would be having a no pet policy, but making an exception for people who have service animals. The ADA is pretty expansive. It covers both architectural access and programs and services. And really, your only defense against providing equal access would be if it would cause a fundamental alteration to the program that you're offering, or it would be an undue burden or hardship. The ADA covers 3 different sections. Title I is the first section and deals with employment. We're not going to be talking very much about that today. There's Title II and Title III. Title II covers local and state government entities, so that would include publicly owned and operated facilities. That could be a theater, it could be a city or state-run museum, it could be a city or municipal zoo, etc. Title III is likely what you are if you're listening to this, and that's a place of public accommodation. So those are privately operated facilities and nonprofits that could include theaters, museums, zoos, parks, convention centers, restaurants, retail stores, hotels, etc. This includes nonprofits. One of the most applicable sections of the ADA when it comes to nonprofit cultural organizations like yourself is effective communication. So effective communication is really making sure that whatever we're trying to communicate to visitors is provided in alternate formats, so that, say, if I was a deaf visitor and there was a lot of verbal information being shared, that there was another format, another way for me to access that information. So really, when we're talking about effective communication, we're talking about redundancy and providing something in another format for someone else. So examples for people who are blind or have low vision could be providing alternative formats of print materials, such as using Braille, large print, recording things, even using our iPhones or cell phones, and also providing electronic formats of things. So if you provide a Word document, people who have screen readers who are blind would be able to access it. There are other ways to provide effective communication depending upon what type of disability we're talking about. So that could include certified American Sign Language, ASL interpreters. It could be real-time captioning, with the acronym for that is CART. It could be captioning our videos or audio information, thinking about audio guides, or thinking about even Facebook videos that we might share, making sure that those are captioned for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, or for people who might have the sound off and they're watching at work, for instance. Assistive listening devices, ALDs, for performances and exhibitions, which would help people who have low hearing. And audio description for people who are blind or have low vision. And it's important to be considering effective communication both in person, those in-person experiences that we might offer our visitors, as well as on our website and all of the different ways that people experience our organization. And really, the only defense you have against providing effective communication is if it would be a fundamental alteration of what you're offering, or would be an undue burden or hardship, which is pretty difficult to prove when we're talking about adding captioning to videos, for instance. Shifting gears for a minute, let's talk a little bit about Section 504. Section 504 is part of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs and activities, public and private, that receive federal financial assistance. So that's the key, is federal. The relationship of Section 504 to the ADA is an important one to understand. Entities covered by both Title III, Places of Public Accommodation, of the ADA, and Section 504 must comply with both laws. Compliance with one does not guarantee compliance with the other. There are some differences that are important to understand. Section 504 provides for equal opportunity to enter facilities and participate in programs and activities. It does not require every part of every facility or program to be accessible, whereas the ADA would, for instance. The relationship of Section 504 and the ADA to the IACA program grant is an important one to understand. You might be asking yourself, why does this all matter to me if I'm receiving money from the Illinois Arts Council? The answer is the Illinois Arts Council Agency, IACA, supports universal access to the arts, first and foremost. The agency abides by state and federal laws that prohibit public support to organizations, people, or entities that knowingly and or unknowingly discriminate against people with disabilities. Each grantee is required to assure that they are in compliance with Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, the ADA. What is disability? That's an important thing for us to understand here today. Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA definition, defines disability as someone who has a record of, or is regarded as having a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, which could include eating, breathing, walking, talking, seeing, etc. It also includes temporary disabilities. So thinking about somebody with a broken leg or someone recovering from surgery or even someone who's pregnant. And it's really important for us to remember when we're talking about disability that anyone may be disabled at any time. There's a really great quote that I like that says the difference between a person with a disability and a person without a disability is 10 seconds. There are other definitions of disability as well. The World Health Organization, WHO, has a definition that reflects the social model of disability. It's considering disability as a contextual variable, dynamic over time and in relation to circumstances. Really, one is more or less disabled based upon the interaction between the person and the individual, the institutional, and the social environments. Thinking about a museum that has many flights of stairs leading to the entrance. The person who uses a wheelchair is prevented from getting inside that museum because the stairs are there, not because they're in a wheelchair. So realizing that society has created a lot of these barriers. Why does accessibility matter? First, I think it's important for us to look at our mission as cultural nonprofits. In our mission, there's usually some sort of mention of creating a positive experience for everyone, for all visitors. So remembering that disability is a part of that. I also believe that everyone has the right to participate fully in the cultural life of their community. So it's also a civil rights issue as well. It's good business as well because we know that people with disabilities have discretionary income that they can spend at your nonprofit. And finally, it's also the law. We have the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, that we learned a little bit about. We also know that Section 504 of the 1973 Rehab Act also applies. And in addition, there's also local and state laws that also can dictate how we treat people with disabilities. How many people have disabilities? It's really hard to say precisely, but we know that likely 1 in 5 Americans has some type of disability. Disability is also really interesting because it's truly intersectional, that it affects people regardless of age, race, social status, etc. We know that around 37% of seniors over age 65 in Illinois have some type of disability. 1 in 3 families include a person with a disability. For instance, my brother has Down syndrome. I don't have a disability, but my brother does. And so it's important for us as a family to choose activities where we feel like all of us are fully included and welcomed. Another important thing to remember is that some disabilities are visible. It might be a wheelchair user, it could be a blind person who uses a white cane, but there are many disabilities that are invisible, that are not visible. And so it's important to remember that even if we can't see that somebody has a disability, that we take them at their word, and also know that very likely 1 in 5 of us has a disability of some kind. Let's talk now about appointing an accessibility coordinator, which is a requirement of IACA grant recipients effective 2019. The first thing for us to remember is that even though we're appointing a point person basically for accessibility at our organization, accessibility is and needs to be the responsibility of every department and the leadership of our organizations. The accessibility coordinator is the point person for access, like we said, and maybe an additional role for a current employee, or eventually we plan for the accessibility coordinator to become a separate role, or if we have a larger organization, it might need to be a dedicated position. Usually this role is found in the education or programming departments. It could be found in human resources, but it's really important that the human resources department remember that it's not just Title I, that it's also Title III of the ADA. It might also be found in the visitor services or the audience services department. The accessibility coordinator is really also there to ensure the compliance of ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and Section 504. They're also really a consultant to the board and the staff around access-related issues. And they're also going to ensure that planning for accessibility is incorporated into organizational decisions. The executive director and board members, with assistance from the accessibility coordinator, provide leadership in implementing access throughout the organization. Another role of the accessibility coordinator is to handle accommodation requests that are made by guests. So guests need to have a way to contact the coordinator, so it's important to have a phone number and an email address that can easily be found on the website and in collateral material for people to be able to contact the access coordinator to make those requests and to have that conversation. Another requirement of IACA grant recipients is to fill out the Section 504 self-evaluation workbook. So this is really the responsibility of the accessibility coordinator, but it's not just on them alone. It's in consultation with colleagues from other departments as necessary. You might need to speak with colleagues in human resources, in the programming department, in audience services, really looking across the organization, and it's not possible for someone to fill this out totally alone. It's really important to fill out the workbook honestly and in its entirety. One of the purposes of the workbook is really to help you understand the breadth of Section 504 and ADA. It covers a lot of different aspects of our organizations, and so this workbook is really trying to make that clear. It's also meant to show you what areas you might be lacking and really prompt you to make a plan to improve them. No one's going to fill out the workbook and have it perfectly correct every single section. The workbook should be printed and should be kept on file. Let's talk now about people first language. Sometimes cultural administrators that I talk with aren't sure how to talk about people with disabilities, so they don't say anything at all. So I really want to equip you with the correct information so you know how to talk about visitors with disabilities, and you can hopefully feel a little bit more comfortable. Language is a big cue to our guests about our philosophy and our approach. So it's a major cue and important for us to show that we're making an effort and have correct language. Language does shift, and how people want to be referred to does change, but generally speaking, for organization-wide communications, it's still accepted and encouraged to use people-first language. Really, people-first language is all about putting people before their disabilities. We're not going to call people just their disability. For instance, we're not going to say the blind, the deaf. We're going to call them people who are blind, or a blind person, or someone who is deaf, or a deaf person. It's important that we avoid euphemism or sensationalizing disability. We see this a lot in the media, and I really encourage you now to be looking for it when you watch the news next, to think about special needs and thinking about what's so special about special needs, thinking about challenges, thinking about differently abled, thinking about suffers from Parkinson's, all of these ways that we are really euphemizing or sensationalizing disability. We want to avoid outdated language like handicapped or crippled or wheelchair bound. And positive ways to say those words instead would be handicapped bathroom would be the accessible bathroom. Crippled could be someone with a physical disability. and wheelchair bound would be wheelchair user. So this is just stating very matter-of-factly what the disability is and making it less about sensationalizing or using old school ways of talking about people. It's also really important to be aware of nuance, understanding that a capital D deaf person is different than a lowercase d deaf person. And there is some more information about that on the resources page that will go along with this PowerPoint. When you're talking to people one-on-one, the language that people use to talk about their own disability and themselves may be different than this. And that's when it's really important to have a conversation with someone and ask them, what's your preference? I get a lot of questions about reaching out to the disability community or communities, and it's really important to be involving and including people with disabilities in our cultural organizations for a variety of reasons, but especially because one of the credos of the disability rights movement is nothing about us without us. We need to be very careful as people in cultural organizations to not be making decisions for people with disabilities without including them in the decisions themselves. You can identify and contact different disability organizations as a good place to start. And I also encourage you to connect with local arts nonprofits who are already doing this work. Oftentimes, they're very open to sharing their mailing lists or to reach out to their audiences and invite them to come to your next event or your next program that will be accessible. Thinking about some tips for accommodation requests when guests with disabilities reach out to you as a nonprofit organization and request sign language interpretation or request something to be audio described or could request a variety of different things. It's really important that you do not make assumptions about what they need, that you ask them. It's really key that this becomes a conversation and not you imposing something on somebody else. It's really also important to remember that there is no one-size-fits-all type of solution. For instance, when a guest with hearing loss is requesting an accommodation, they could be requesting ASL, American Sign Language interpretation. They could prefer to access information through captions, so they are requesting captioning. They might need an assistive listening device because they do have some hearing. So it's really important to have that conversation with the guest to figure out what they need and what you can offer them. It's also really key that you have a way for them to request accommodations, that there is a phone number and an email address for someone to reach the accessibility coordinator. If someone requests something you can't do or have never done before, I really encourage you to stop and have a conversation with that guest or have a conversation with your colleagues. Your immediate answer should not be no. It should be let me check. There are some accommodations that can be scheduled in advance, and others can be handled by request. The advantage of scheduling something in advance is that it takes some of the stress out of the situation. It also can mean that you can promote the event better and have more people with disabilities attending. The ADA does prohibit passing the costs of these accommodations on to visitors. So if you, for instance, were to hire an American Sign Language interpreter for an event, you can't expect the person who's deaf who requested this service to pay for the interpreter. It's the responsibility of the organization to cover that cost. I encourage you to incorporate inclusive design practices and concepts into all of your projects as well, because that will minimize the number of last-minute accommodations or modifications that you need to make and will hopefully bake in accessibility more thoroughly and fully into the project or program. If you're feeling daunted or overwhelmed right now about starting accessibility at your organization, I want to calm you down and tell you that incremental change is key to all of this. It's not possible to become totally accessible and totally inclusive overnight. It's key to first identify low-hanging fruit. What are some easy changes or adjustments that we can make? One example might be to offer American Sign Language interpretation at an event, or to be updating our website and collateral material with accommodation request information. It's also really important to collaborate with colleagues at different nonprofits. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. Everyone is grappling with these same concerns and same opportunities, and so we can work together to make things easier for all of us. Being a small nonprofit, while it's challenging, is not an excuse. In some ways, I see the most creative and most innovative access accommodations and services provided by smaller nonprofits because we know how to be creative and do a lot with a little. Staff training is often a key component as well to creating institutional change around accessibility. So starting with new hires or front of house staff and looking at how can we better welcome and include people with disabilities. There are lots of resources that you can turn to. I've made a resource document for you to check out that includes a lot of links and a lot of contact information to help you get started. Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium, CCAC, is a really great resource, and I'll talk more about that in a second. In Chicago, we also are fortunate to have the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. They can be a really important resource for us. And we're really lucky in the Midwest to have free confidential technical assistance provided by Great Lakes ADA Center. So you literally can call a 1-800 number. It's 1-800-949-4232. And you can ask any question about the ADA or Section 504 as it pertains to your organization. I've called them on a weekly basis with little questions or bigger questions that come up. The National Endowment for the Arts, NEA, has an office for accessibility, and they're another great resource to turn to. The Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in DC has many, many great resources and is really the gold standard when it comes to accessibility. And they also organize the Leadership Exchange in Arts and Disability LEAD conference that happens every August that I highly recommend you start budgeting for and planning for to send someone from your organization, probably the accessibility coordinator. Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium, CCAC, is a nonprofit that I started when I moved to Chicago 6 years ago. We believe everyone deserves access to Chicago's rich arts and culture, and we empower Chicago's cultural spaces to become more accessible to visitors with disabilities through our accessible equipment loan program that we administer with Steppenwolf Theater Company, through our monthly professional development workshop trainings, through our access calendar that lists accessible performances and programs happening around the Chicago region, and most importantly, through building a network of arts and cultural administrators. It's easy to feel overwhelmed and daunted by accessibility and by these changes to the IACA grant requirements. But it's important to remember every cultural organization was or is in your situation. And really through ongoing training, learning, and conversations, we are all making our institutions more accessible together.